I lost my job. I lost my home. My family thinks I'm broken and dragging them down. But that wasn't the real test. The real test came when a stranger walked into my brother's living room and offered him $100,000 if he agreed to erase me from his life. Blood or bank account, loyalty or profit, and I was listening to every word. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, or you've questioned where loyalty truly ends, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I never thought I would become the kind of man who tested his own family, but life has a way of stripping away who you think you are and replacing it with someone you barely recognize. For most of my adult life, I was the dependable one, the steady paycheck, the emergency call at 2 in the morning, the brother who always said yes. When my parents passed, I stepped into the quiet role of glue, the one who paid bills without talking about it and showed up without needing praise. I believed, deeply and foolishly, that love worked the same way I gave it, silently, loyally, without conditions. That belief began to crack the day I lost my job. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no escort out of the building, just a small conference room, a rehearsed apology, and a cardboard box that suddenly felt heavier than it should. I told myself it was temporary. I had savings, I had skills, I had family. But weeks turned into months, and optimism thinned like worn fabric. The savings drained faster than I expected. Medical bills from an old injury resurfaced, and the house I thought I owned outright became a reminder of how fragile security really is. When the foreclosure notice came, I stared at it for a long time before folding it neatly and sliding it into a drawer. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. Pride is a strange thing. It doesn't scream, it whispers that you can still fix this, that you don't need help, that needing help will change how people see you, and I wasn't ready to be seen differently. The eviction was quieter than I imagined. A knock, paperwork, a date circled in red. I packed what I could fit into my car and left the rest behind, like pieces of a life I wasn't allowed to finish living. That night, I slept in my car and listened to my own breathing, wondering how a man can do everything right and still end up there. That was the night the idea first came to me, not as revenge, but as clarity. I didn't want pity. I wanted the truth. I told my family I had lost everything. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften it either. I said the words plainly. The job was gone, the house was gone, the savings were gone. I waited for the warmth I had given them for years to come back to me. Instead, there was a pause, a subtle shift, the kind you feel before someone changes how they speak to you. My sister offered sympathy, the polite kind that ends with distance. My aunt told me to pray harder. My cousins stopped calling altogether. And my brother, Aaron, the one I had stood beside through his divorce, his debts, his failures, went quiet in a way that hurt the most. He didn't say no when I asked if I could stay with him for a while, but the hesitation sat heavy in the air between us. When I arrived with my duffel bag, his smile didn't reach his eyes. Living under someone else's roof changes the balance of a relationship. I became careful with my footsteps, my words, my existence. I washed dishes immediately, ate less, stayed out late so I wouldn't be in the way. And slowly the comments began. Not cruel, just sharp enough to cut. Jokes about being between opportunities, reminders about how expensive things were getting, long sighs when bills came in the mail. I watched myself shrink in his presence, and that hurt more than sleeping in my car ever did. That's when the test stopped being hypothetical. I needed to know if the love I had given him was ever really returned, or if it had only existed while I was useful. I didn't want to expose them publicly. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I just wanted to know where I stood. So I planned carefully, quietly, methodically. I hired an actor, a professional, recommended by a friend in media production, someone who understood restraint. He was older, well-dressed, calm, the kind of man whose confidence didn't need volume. We built a backstory simple enough to be believable. He was a private investor, interested in a small construction deal Aaron had once mentioned in passing. The offer would be outrageous, yes, but not impossible. $100,000, clean, immediate. The condition would be the poison hidden in the honey. I installed cameras, not to spy for entertainment, but to preserve truth. People forget what they say when no one is supposed to be listening. I needed to remember. I needed to hear it again later, when doubt tried to rewrite history. The day arrived quietly. I left the house early, telling Aaron I had a job interview across town. He nodded, distracted, already half elsewhere. I drove around the block and parked where I could breathe. My hands shook more than I expected. This wasn't a game. This was my family. Whatever happened next would change things forever. From the feed on my phone, I watched the stranger knock. Aaron answered. They shook hands. Small talk. The actor's voice was smooth, respectful. They sat down. Time stretched. My heart pounded as if it were trying to escape my chest. I told myself I was ready for any outcome. I told myself the truth was worth the pain. But when the actor finally leaned forward and said my name, everything inside me went still. He explained the offer clearly, the money, the opportunity, then the condition, delivered gently, almost apologetically. He said I was a liability, a distraction, a risk to future dealings. He said cutting ties would be necessary, permanent, no contact, no support, no exceptions. I watched my brother's face change in real time, and I realized this wasn't just a test of loyalty. It was a test of who we really were when no one was watching. And as the silence stretched between them, I understood that whatever Aaron said next would echo for the rest of my life. My brother didn't answer right away. He leaned back on the couch, rubbing his palms together the way he always did when he was nervous, a habit from childhood that I knew better than he probably did himself. The actor sat patiently, legs crossed, posture relaxed, like a man who had all the time in the world and no emotional stake in the outcome. That contrast made my stomach twist. One of them was family. The other was a stranger holding a checkbook. And yet in that moment, it felt like the stranger had more control over the room than I ever had. Aaron finally laughed, a short, uneasy sound. He said something about how life had been complicated lately, how nothing ever seemed simple anymore. He glanced toward the hallway that led to the guest room, the room I had been sleeping in, as if my presence lingered there like a stain. He asked the actor if he could explain what he meant by cut all ties. His voice was careful, but not offended, curious. That detail hurt more than anger would have. The actor repeated the condition, calmly, professionally. No contact, no financial support, no emotional involvement. He framed it as a necessary boundary for success, not a moral failing. He even said he understood how difficult it was, that family situations were always messy, that sometimes progress required hard decisions. I had written those lines myself, and hearing them spoken out loud felt like swallowing glass. I had designed the blade, now it was pressed against my own throat. Aaron stood up and began pacing. He talked about responsibility, about how he had his own family to think about, how he couldn't afford to be dragged down by someone else's bad luck. He didn't say my name at first. He said someone else, like I was already halfway gone. I felt my chest tighten as memories flooded in uninvited. The night I wired him money so his electricity wouldn't get shut off. The weeks I let him crash on my couch without asking questions. The way I defended him when others called him unreliable. I had never once thought of him as a liability. The actor asked a simple question. He said, "Do you believe your brother will recover?" The way he said it was neutral, almost kind. Aaron stopped pacing. He stared at the floor. There was a long pause, the kind that tells you an answer is forming even before it's spoken. When he finally replied, his voice was quieter. He said he didn't know. He said he'd been carrying him for years, that maybe this was just how things ended sometimes. He said people make their own choices. I flinched. I wanted to scream at the screen that losing a job wasn't a moral failure, that needing help didn't erase a lifetime of giving. But I stayed where I was, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers went numb. This was the truth I had asked for. Interrupting it would only turn it into something else. The actor leaned forward slightly and slid a folder across the coffee table. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He said the money could be transferred within 24 hours, no contracts beyond a simple agreement, clean, easy. He said opportunities like this didn't come often, and hesitation was understandable, but time was limited. Then he stood up, thanked Aaron for his honesty, and said he'd give him the afternoon to think it over. When the door closed behind him, the house felt hollow. Aaron sat back down and put his head in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. I watched every second, hoping for something. A phone call? A moment of resolution? Some sign that blood still meant more than paper. Instead, he reached for his phone and called his wife. I couldn't hear her clearly, but I didn't need to. Aaron explained the offer in fragments, pacing again, his voice rising and falling. He said my name then, but not with warmth. He said it like a problem to be solved. He said they had to think about their kids, their future, their stability. He said I was stuck, that I wasn't getting any older, that this could be their chance to finally breathe. He didn't say he loved me. He didn't say he was torn. He said it made sense. I ended the feed before the call finished. I couldn't listen anymore. The pain had shifted into something sharper, more focused. It wasn't grief. It was clarity. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel, feeling like a fool for ever doubting what I had just seen. The test had already been answered even before the final decision. Loyalty doesn't negotiate. I waited until evening. I wanted them to sit with it, to let the weight of the choice settle into their bones. When I finally walked back into the house, the air felt different. Aaron looked up from the table like he'd been caught doing something wrong, though he didn't know I already knew. His wife avoided my eyes entirely. There was a stiffness to their movements, a tension that hadn't been there before. Secrets changed the temperature of a room. We ate dinner together in near silence. Every bite tasted like dust. I watched Aaron closely, noticing how he flinched whenever his phone buzzed, how his jaw tightened when I spoke. At one point, he cleared his throat and said he had some news, that an opportunity had come up, something that could really help them. He didn't mention the condition yet. He said we'd talk later. That night, lying on the narrow bed in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the ways this could end. I could confront him immediately, expose the test, reclaim control. I could walk away quietly, letting him take the money and live with the absence. Or I could wait for the moment when he would have to say it to my face, when the words would no longer be abstract. I realized then that this wasn't about punishing him. It was about seeing whether he could own his choice. The next morning, Aaron knocked on my door. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets, eyes darting. He said he'd been thinking a lot. He said times were hard, that everyone had to make sacrifices. He said he loved me, but love didn't pay bills. He didn't say the word money, but it hung between us like smoke. He asked if he'd understand if he needed space, if it might be better for everyone if I found somewhere else to go. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not even sadness. Acceptance, the kind that comes when illusion finally dies. I nodded slowly and said I understood. His shoulders relaxed instantly, relief washing over him so visibly it almost made me laugh. In that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I told him I'd be out by the end of the day. I thanked him for his honesty, and as I closed the door behind him, I prepared myself for the reveal that would change everything. Once the door closed, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of the house waking up. Cups clinked in the kitchen, a drawer slid open and shut. Life went on as if nothing monumental had just happened, and that realization stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had always believed betrayal would feel loud, explosive, undeniable. Instead, it was quiet, practical, wrapped in the language of responsibility. That, I was learning, was how most people justified walking away. I packed my duffel bag slowly, folding each shirt with care, not because it mattered, but because the ritual steadied me. Every item carried a memory. A jacket I'd lent Aaron years ago and never got back. A watch our father gave me before he passed. I paused over that one, running my thumb along the worn leather strap, thinking about how Dad used to say that family was the only wealth that couldn't be taken from you. I wondered what he would say now, watching his sons negotiate loyalty like a transaction. Before leaving the room, I checked the cameras one last time. The feed showed Aaron on the phone again, pacing near the window, his voice tense but excited. I didn't need to hear the words to know who he was speaking to. The decision had been made. All that remained was the paperwork and the illusion that he was doing the right thing. I drove away with no destination in mind, just a need for space. I parked at a quiet overlook outside the city, a place I used to come when life felt too loud. I sat there, engine off, and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The disappointment, the sense of being expendable, the grief of realizing that generosity, when unreciprocated, can slowly turn into invisibility. I cried, not because I had been rejected, but because I had finally seen clearly. The actor called me around noon. He said Aaron had accepted the offer. No hesitation. He'd asked a few logistical questions, mostly about timing and discretion, but there had been no moral resistance. The words landed heavily, even though I had expected them. Hearing them out loud made it final. I thanked the actor and told him to proceed as planned. We agreed on the moment of the reveal. It would be clean, no theatrics, just truth. I returned to the house in the late afternoon to collect the last of my things. Aaron and his wife were waiting in the living room, their postures stiff, like people bracing for impact. Aaron gestured for me to sit. He cleared his throat and began a speech he'd clearly rehearsed. He talked about love again, about difficult choices, about how this wasn't permanent, just necessary. He said he hoped I'd understand one day. I listened quietly, letting him finish. When he finally looked up, searching my face for anger or pleading, I gave him neither. I told him I had something to show him. His brow furrowed, confused. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, setting it on the table between us. I didn't press play yet. I told him I knew about the offer. I told him I knew about the condition. I told him I knew he'd accepted. The color drained from his face so quickly it startled even me. His wife's eyes widened, darting between us. He asked how I could possibly know. I told him the truth, calmly, without accusation. I said it had been a test. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence and the hum of the refrigerator. Then Aaron exploded. He stood up, knocking over a chair, his voice rising in disbelief and fury. He accused me of manipulation, of entrapment, of playing with people's lives. He said it was cruel to test family like that no one deserved to be put in that position. I let him speak. Every word he hurled only confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't angry about the choice he'd made. He was angry that it had been exposed. When he finally stopped, breathless, I pressed play. The room filled with his own voice, calm and rational, explaining why cutting ties with me made sense, explaining how I was a burden, explaining how the money would change everything. His wife covered her mouth. He stared at the phone like it was a mirror he didn't recognize. I watched his expression shift from anger to shock to something that looked like shame, though I couldn't be sure. I stopped the recording before it ended. I told him I didn't need to hear the rest. I told him the test wasn't about the money or even the decision. It was about honesty, about whether he would defend me when it cost him something. I told him he hadn't failed because he chose security. He failed because he chose it without acknowledging my humanity. His wife began to cry softly. She said she hadn't meant for it to go this far, that she thought it was just talk. I nodded. People always think betrayal is theoretical until it's irreversible. I told them the money was never coming. The actor was paid by me. The offer was never real. The condition, however, was, and they had accepted it willingly. Aaron sank back onto the couch, head in his hands, the same posture I'd seen hours earlier. But this time, there was no relief in his body, only collapse. He asked me what I wanted now, an apology, a promise, forgiveness? The question hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I told him I didn't want anything from him, not money, not explanations, not even regret. I told him the test had given me something far more valuable than $100,000. It had given me clarity. I said I would be leaving and that I wouldn't be coming back. Not because I was angry, but because trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild on demand. I picked up my bag and headed for the door. Behind me, Aaron called my name. For a split second, I considered turning around. Then I remembered the relief on his face when he thought I was leaving for good, and I kept walking. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. I took a deep breath and felt a strange, quiet sense of freedom. As I drove away, I realized the reveal wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different kind of reckoning, one that wouldn't be resolved in a single conversation or confrontation. The real consequences were still unfolding, and I would have to decide how much of my life I was willing to rebuild without the people I once called family. The first night after I left my brother's house, I slept in my car again, parked along a quiet residential street where no one would question a vehicle sitting too long. I folded the back seat down and stretched out as best I could, staring up at the dark ceiling, replaying every moment of the confrontation. Not because I doubted myself, but because my mind kept searching for the man I thought my brother was, as if he might still appear in the cracks of the memory. He never did. What remained was the version who calculated my worth and found it lacking. Morning came softly, birds, distant traffic, the slow return of the world. I washed my face in a gas station restroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked older, not just tired, but altered, like something fundamental had shifted behind my eyes. I realized then that betrayal doesn't just take something from you. It forces you to grow around the wound, whether you're ready or not. My phone buzzed while I was drinking bad coffee from a paper cup. A message from Aaron. Just one line. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time before locking my phone and slipping it into my pocket. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. Talking wouldn't undo what had already been revealed, and I needed distance to hear my own thoughts without his voice trying to rewrite them. Over the next few days, word spread through the family. It always does. Stories mutate as they travel, shaped by guilt and self-preservation. Some people heard that I had tested Aaron unfairly. Others heard that he had failed me spectacularly. A few reached out, cautiously, as if checking whether aligning with me was safe. I answered politely, briefly, without offering details. I had learned that explanations often become weapons in the wrong hands. One afternoon, my sister called. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said Aaron had told her everything, or at least his version of it. She asked if it was true, if I had really staged the entire thing. I said yes. She sighed and said she didn't know what to think, that family shouldn't test family. I asked her quietly what she would have done if someone offered her money to erase me. There was a long pause. Then she said she didn't know. That answer told me everything I needed to hear. I found temporary work through an old contact, nothing glamorous, but enough to stabilize me. The routine helped. It reminded me that my value wasn't tied to how others perceived my usefulness. Each day, I rebuilt a small piece of myself, brick by brick. I moved into a modest room in a shared apartment, the kind of place where everyone keeps to themselves, bound together only by rent and courtesy. It was lonely, but it was mine. Aaron didn't stop trying to reach me. Calls, messages, emails. His tone shifted from defensive to remorseful to desperate. He apologized, then justified, then apologized again. He said he felt trapped, that he'd been under pressure, that he never thought the money would be real. That part almost made me laugh. The condition was real enough. The choice was real enough. Regret, I was learning, often arrives only after the consequences do. Weeks passed. The sharpness of the pain dulled into something more manageable. I stopped waking up with a knot in my chest. I started sleeping through the night. I even laughed again, surprised by the sound of it. Healing isn't a straight line, but it does move forward if you let it. Still, there were moments when memory ambushed me. A song, a smell, a shared joke that no longer belonged to anyone. One evening, as I was leaving work, I saw Aaron's car parked across the street. My stomach dropped. He stepped out as soon as he saw me, looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slumped. He said he just wanted 5 minutes. I considered walking past him, but something in his expression stopped me. Not hope, just exhaustion. We stood on the sidewalk, the city moving around us. He apologized again, this time without excuses. He said seeing himself on that recording had broken something in him, that he hadn't recognized the man he heard speaking. He said he had been scared of ending up like me. The words stung, but they were honest. I appreciated that at least. I told him I believed his fear was real, but fear doesn't excuse betrayal. I told him trust isn't rebuilt through words alone, and even actions can't always repair what's been broken. He asked if there was any way forward. I thought about it carefully. I told him maybe, someday, but not now, and not in the way things were before. Some relationships don't end, they transform into something smaller, quieter, more distant. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and thanked me for listening. When he left, I felt lighter, not because I forgave him, but because I'd set a boundary and held it. That was new for me, powerful in its own quiet way. As time went on, I reflected often on the test itself. Was it ethical? Was it cruel? Maybe, but it had stripped away illusion and replaced it with truth. And truth, even when painful, gives you the chance to choose your future with open eyes. I had learned that loyalty isn't proven by words spoken in comfort, but by actions taken under pressure. The story didn't end with a dramatic reconciliation or a villain's downfall. It ended with something more realistic. A man learning who he was without the weight of expectation. A family forced to confront the cost of their choices. And a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Never confuse proximity with loyalty, and never measure your worth by how much you're willing to sacrifice for people who wouldn't do the same for you. The final chapter was still unwritten, not just for me, but for everyone involved. And whether it would bring closure or simply quiet acceptance remained to be seen. After that encounter on the sidewalk, something inside me finally settled. Not healed, not whole, but anchored. For the first time since everything unraveled, I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped imagining alternate endings where people chose differently. I accepted that the truth had already done its work. The rest was just living with the outcome. I focused on building a life that didn't rely on anyone's approval. I took extra shifts. I saved carefully. I kept my circle small. There was peace in that simplicity. When you're no longer performing loyalty for others, you discover how quiet your mind can become. I started waking up early just to walk. No destination, just movement. Each step felt like a reminder that I was still moving forward, even if the path looked nothing like the one I'd imagined. Family gatherings came and went without me. Invitations stopped arriving, not out of malice, but discomfort. I had become a mirror they didn't want to look into. I didn't blame them. Accountability is heavy, and not everyone is willing to carry it. Occasionally, someone would text me late at night, a cousin or an aunt, asking how I was really doing. I answered honestly, without bitterness. I was surviving. I was learning. I was free in ways I hadn't been before. One evening, my sister showed up unannounced at my apartment. She stood in the doorway awkwardly, holding a grocery bag like a peace offering. We sat at my small kitchen table and talked for hours. She admitted she'd judged me, that she'd been afraid of what my situation said about all of us. She said the test had scared her because it forced her to ask herself uncomfortable questions. I listened, not interrupting. When she finished, I told her, fear reveals character just as much as courage does. We didn't resolve everything that night, but we reopened a door that had quietly closed. A month later, I received an envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Aaron. Not an apology this time, a confession. He wrote about his childhood insecurities, about always feeling like he was living in my shadow, about how my failure had terrified him because it suggested his own stability was fragile. He wrote that the money had represented safety, not greed, but he understood now that choosing safety at the cost of family had left him with neither. At the bottom, he wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, he just wanted me to know he was trying to become someone better. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond, not because he didn't deserve acknowledgement, but because some conversations need time before words can be trusted again. Growth doesn't demand immediate validation. Sometimes it just needs space. Work began to improve. The temporary role turned into something more stable. My confidence returned slowly, not the loud kind, but the grounded kind that doesn't need to prove itself. I stopped introducing myself through my past, stopped explaining where I'd been or what I'd lost. I focused on where I was going. That shift changed how people treated me, but more importantly, how I treated myself. Occasionally, I thought about the test and how viewers, strangers, would judge it. Some would say I went too far, others would cheer, but the truth was simpler than any headline. I didn't test my family to punish them. I tested them because I needed to know whether I was loved for who I was or for what I provided. The answer hurt, but it also freed me from a lifetime of unbalanced giving. One night, as I was locking up at work, I caught my reflection in the glass door. I looked steady, not triumphant, not broken, just steady. And I realized that was the real reward. Not money, not revenge, stability within myself, the ability to walk away from relationships that required me to shrink. I don't know what the future holds for my family. Maybe bridges will rebuild in new shapes. Maybe some will remain burned. What I do know is this: loyalty cannot be bought, tested, or demanded. It reveals itself when the cost is high and the audience is gone. And I had finally learned to believe people the first time they showed me who they were. Time has a way of softening sharp edges without erasing the shape of what cut you. Months passed, and the story of the test slowly faded from daily conversation, but its impact lingered in quieter ways. I noticed it in how people spoke to me now, more carefully, as if aware that I was no longer the version of myself that would bend just to keep peace. I noticed it in myself, most of all, in the way I no longer rushed to fix problems that weren't mine. Aaron and I didn't speak for a long while after the letter, not because either of us was angry anymore, but because silence felt more honest than forced reconciliation. Sometimes distance is the only place where perspective can grow. I thought about him often, not with resentment, but with a sober understanding of how fear can rot good intentions from the inside out. I hoped he was doing the work he claimed he'd started, but I knew better than to hinge my healing on someone else's growth. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was the actor. He said he wanted to check in, not as part of the job, but as a human being. He told me he played many roles over the years, but this one stayed with him. He said watching a family unravel so quietly had reminded him how fragile loyalty really is. Before hanging up, he said something that stuck with me. He said, "You didn't break your family. You revealed the cracks that were already there." Hearing that from an outsider brought an unexpected sense of validation. Around the same time, my sister began calling more regularly. Our conversations were cautious at first, like walking on thin ice, but gradually they warmed. She admitted that watching what happened between Aaron and me had forced her to reconsider how she measured success and failure. She said she'd always believed that stability was proof of virtue and collapse was proof of weakness. Seeing how quickly people turned away from me had shaken that belief. We didn't rewrite our past, but we started building something more honest on top of it. The holidays came, and with them the familiar ache of absence. I spent Thanksgiving alone, cooking a small meal and eating it by the window, watching families gather across the street. It was lonely, yes, but it was also peaceful. There were no forced smiles, no undercurrent of judgment, just quiet gratitude for the roof over my head and the fact that I'd survived something that could have broken me. On Christmas morning, I received a message from Aaron, just 2 words, "I understand now." I stared at the screen for a long time. Those words didn't fix anything, but they mattered. Understanding is often the first step toward accountability, and accountability is the soil where real change might grow. I replied with a simple, "I hope so." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. It was truth. As the new year began, opportunities opened up in unexpected ways. A former colleague reached out with a job offer that aligned perfectly with my skills. It paid better, offered stability, and came with something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: respect. On my first day, as I sat at my new desk, I felt a quiet pride. Not because I had proven anyone wrong, but because I had rebuilt myself without sacrificing my integrity. With stability came reflection. I thought often about how easily love becomes conditional when resources are scarce, how quickly people redraw boundaries when fear enters the room, and how dangerous it is to confuse survival instincts with moral justification. The test had exposed those truths brutally, but it had also forced me to confront my own patterns. I had given endlessly, not always out of generosity, but sometimes out of a need to be needed. Losing that role had been painful, but it had also been liberating. One evening, I ran into Aaron unexpectedly at a grocery store. We stood awkwardly between shelves, unsure whether to speak. Finally, he broke the silence. He told me he turned down a real investment opportunity recently because it required him to compromise someone else. He said he didn't know if that meant he was changing, but he wanted me to know he was trying. I listened, nodded, and told him growth wasn't a performance, it was a practice. We parted without hugging, without promises, but without hostility. That felt like progress. As I drove home that night, I realized something important. Closure doesn't always come from dramatic apologies or restored relationships. Sometimes it comes from accepting that people are flawed, including yourself, and choosing to live in alignment with your values anyway. I had spent so long trying to be indispensable to my family that I forgot to be faithful to myself. The story of the $100,000 offer started as a test of loyalty, but it ended as a lesson in self-worth. I no longer wondered who would choose me when things were hard. I had chosen myself, And that, I was learning, was the foundation everything else had to rest on. By the time a full year had passed since the test, the story no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a scar, something permanent, something that had reshaped me but no longer bled when touched. I had settled into my new job, my new routines, my new understanding of what peace actually meant. Peace, I learned, wasn't the absence of conflict, it was the absence of pretending. My relationship with my family existed in fragments now: occasional messages, short phone calls on birthdays, careful updates passed along through my sister. There was no dramatic exile, no formal cutting of ties, just a quiet distancing that everyone seemed to accept without naming. I understood it. I represented a truth they weren't always ready to sit with, that love, when tested, doesn't always pass. One afternoon, my sister invited me to coffee. We met at a small cafe near her work, Neutral Ground. She looked nervous, stirring her drink long after it cooled. Finally, she told me Aaron wanted to see me, not casually, not accidentally in a grocery store, properly. He wanted to talk, she said, because something had happened that forced him to confront everything again. I didn't answer right away. I stared out the window, watching people rush past with lives I would never know. Part of me wanted to protect the stability I'd built, to avoid reopening doors that had slammed shut for good reason. Another part of me recognized that avoidance and boundaries aren't the same thing. One is fear, the other is choice. I told her I would think about it. That night, I barely slept. I replayed the past in fragments: the offer, the recording, the relief on Aaron's face when he thought I was leaving, the shame when he realized I'd heard it all. I asked myself what I actually wanted now, not what would make me look generous, not what would make me look strong, just what was true. I agreed to meet him. We chose a quiet park on the edge of town. Early morning, fewer witnesses. He arrived before me, sitting on a bench, hands clasped tightly like he was holding himself together by force alone. He stood when he saw me, then hesitated, unsure whether to step closer. That hesitation told me more than any apology could have. We sat. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Aaron took a breath and told me his marriage was in trouble. Not directly because of the test, but because it had exposed something deeper. He admitted choosing money over me had forced his wife to confront how easily he rationalized abandoning people when fear took over. Trust between them had cracked. Therapy had followed. Long, uncomfortable conversations. Accountability he couldn't escape. He said something then that stayed with me. He said, "When you walked out that door, I didn't just lose you, I lost the version of myself I thought I was." His voice broke, not dramatically, but quietly, the way it does when someone finally stops defending themselves. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not desperation, not entitlement, humility. He said he wasn't asking to go back to how things were. He said he knew that was gone. He asked instead if there was any way to build something new, even if it was smaller, slower, and came with conditions. That question lingered in the air. I felt its weight. Forgiveness is often framed as a single act, but in reality, it's a process, one that requires safety, consistency, and time. I told him the truth. I said I didn't trust him the way I once had, and I didn't know if I ever would again. I said trust wasn't something I could give because someone finally understood the lesson. It was something earned through sustained change. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't rush to promise anything. He said he understood and that he would accept whatever distance I needed. That response mattered. It showed me he was finally listening without trying to control the outcome. We walked a short distance together before parting. There was no hug, just a quiet acknowledgement that something painful had been faced honestly. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being denied anymore. Later that week, I reflected deeply on the test itself, on how many people had opinions about it without ever living through something similar. Some would say it was manipulative, others would say it was justified, but the truth was more personal than moral. I had needed certainty in a moment when uncertainty was destroying me. I had needed to know if I was loved when I had nothing left to offer. That need didn't make me cruel, it made me human. I also understood something else now. The test hadn't only revealed my family, it had revealed me. My tendency to overgive, my fear of being abandoned if I stopped being useful, my belief that loyalty had to be earned through sacrifice. Losing that belief hurt, but it also freed me from it. The $100,000 offer was never really about money. It was about value, about whether my worth existed independently of my success. And while the answer from my family was complicated and painful, the answer I gave myself was clear. I was enough, even when I had nothing. And that realization was the real turning point of the story. The meeting in the park didn't change my life overnight, but it did something quieter and more important. It closed a door I'd been standing in front of for too long, not by slamming it shut, but by letting me decide how wide it would stay open, if at all. For the first time since everything happened, I felt like the past was behind me instead of underneath me. I didn't rush into rebuilding anything with Aaron. We exchanged a few messages over the following months, brief and careful. He respected my boundaries in a way he never had before, and that alone told me he was finally learning. I watched from a distance as he continued therapy, as he struggled honestly instead of defensively. I didn't step in to guide him or reassure him. That was no longer my role. Growth, I had learned, can't be supervised. Life, meanwhile, kept moving. My career stabilized further, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady progress. I paid off old debts. I upgraded from the shared apartment to a small place of my own. The first night I slept there, alone, surrounded by boxes and bare walls, I sat on the floor and felt something close to pride. Not the loud kind that needs witnesses, but the quiet kind that comes from surviving something that almost hollowed you out. I began to notice how differently I approached relationships now. I no longer rushed to prove my value. I no longer filled silence with favors or equated sacrifice with love. When people showed up inconsistently, I believed them. When they showed up consistently, I appreciated it without clinging. The test had sharpened my discernment in ways I never expected. Pain, when processed honestly, becomes wisdom. One evening, my sister invited me over for dinner, just the two of us. No agenda, no updates about Aaron. We cooked together, laughed, talked about ordinary things. At one point, she looked at me and said something simple but profound. She said, "You seem lighter." I nodded. I was. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped carrying what was never mine to hold. As for my family as a whole, the dynamics had changed permanently. Some relationships softened, others faded. A few surprised me with quiet accountability. I accepted all of it without chasing explanations. I understood now that closure doesn't come from everyone admitting fault. It comes from you no longer needing them to. Sometimes I think back to the moment the actor slid that folder across the table. $100,000, a number designed to overwhelm reason, to tempt fear into pretending it was logic. I think about how easily that number redefined me in someone else's mind, how quickly I became a liability instead of a brother. And then I think about how easily I once defined myself by what I could provide, not by who I was. That is the real danger of money. Not that it changes people, but that it reveals what they already prioritize when pressure enters the room. I don't regret the test, not because it hurt others, but because it saved me from a lifetime of conditional belonging. It showed me that loyalty spoken in comfort is cheap, but loyalty practiced under threat is rare. and rare things should never be taken for granted. If there is a moral to this story, it's not about revenge or exposure. It's about self-respect. It's about understanding that love without boundaries becomes self-erasure. It's about recognizing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop auditioning for a place in someone else's life. I once believed family was defined by proximity and history. Now I understand it's defined by choice, by who stands beside you when standing costs them something. And while that truth cost me relationships I thought were permanent, it gave me something far more enduring: peace. So if you're listening to this and you're afraid to see who would stay when you have nothing left to give, ask yourself this instead. Are you staying loyal to yourself? Are you honoring your own worth when others won't? Because when everything else falls away, that relationship is the one you will live with every single day. I lost a job, I lost a home, I lost the illusion of unconditional support, but I gained clarity, boundaries, and a life built on truth instead of obligation. And no amount of money could ever replace that.